Hi, friends. I'm back, and let's dive in and talk about where expenses fall into your pricing strategy and why they kind of don't really fall into your pricing strategy. So, to step back for a moment, when I say expenses, I am talking about overhead. I am not talking about the raw materials that go into making what you make. I am not talking about the items that you order for your retail store to sell. I am talking about things like rent, things like utilities, things like your phone and internet, things like your payroll, all of those small things like your legal payments, your accountant payments, your insurance payments, all of the things that you have to do in order to have your business. All of the things that you have to do to stay open, your business license, your, like I mentioned, your insurance payments, all of those things that you have to have, but don't necessarily make you any money, right? How do those fit into your pricing strategy? Well, the shortest possible answer is that in a lot of ways, they don't really fit into your pricing. They're not really recognized in a pricing formula, especially for smaller makers. They're not really recognized in a pricing formula for retailers, but they are important for understanding your whole pricing strategy and what you need your pricing strategy to cover and do for your business. So, to also just wheel this back for a moment, I will say that at larger manufacturing levels, certain elements of your expenses and your overhead do factor into pricing and are somewhat recognized in pricing. But for a lot of you who are solo makers or have a small staff, they don't factor in as that one-to-one ratio of like, I purchased my gold, I purchased my beads, I purchased my findings, and I will mark them up and calculate my labor and formulate a price. They aren't really recognized in that pricing formula. Now, elements of your overhead do appear in your pricing, generally when we're talking about things like your time and your labor. Because for a lot of you, if you are considering, say, hiring somebody in the coming year, you might be looking at things like your time and your labor rates to determine whether or not you have enough cushion to hire someone. So the payroll does start to kind of factor into your pricing a little bit. And this is why I always, almost always, recommend that you set yourself up with a fairly generous labor rate from the get go so that you have the space in your budget to hire people. Another way that some of you might find that this factors into your pricing strategy, especially for those of you who might have a store in addition to your jewelry production business, or a store in addition to your ceramics business, or a store in addition to or as an adjunct of your craft business. Because there are some common calculations in retail that want you to know what your sales per square foot are in your retail space, because this gives you a really good view of whether or not you are totally getting hosed on your rental rate or whether or not your rental rate is really producing for you. So sometimes that does factor in, maybe not directly into a pricing strategy, but those are numbers that you are going to want to know because it will help you make future business decisions. So, I've been turning this topic around lately with my clients and with my students, and as I've spoken with the public about pricing strategies, to rethink how you think about your expenses. And the reality is that a lot of your expenses, and this comes up a lot, by the way, in those monthly and yearly software charges, which is that those bits of overhead can and should be working for you to produce a return on investment, or ROI, as we often shorten it to. What are those expenses doing for you? How are they bolstering your sales? How are they making you more visible? How are they helping with your marketing? How are they helping get your name out there? But most importantly, how is it returning money into your business? So, your expenses and your overhead are there to support the sales in your business. So, I'll take a common thing that comes up with a lot of entrepreneurs, especially people in the craft based industries who may have started on Etsy and then wanted to shift into their own standalone e commerce site. It's a very, very, very common transition that a lot of makers make. And the biggest question that I hear that comes up is, I'm going from Etsy and I'm shifting to Shopify or Wix, which will now come with a monthly charge or a yearly charge. And it feels so expensive. Because, sure, you go from selling on Etsy where you know that for every sale, you're going to be giving up a certain percentage out to Etsy fees. Those could be advertising fees, credit card fees, Etsy selling fees, all kinds of fees, right? So you do know if you make a sale that you're subtracting like 10% of every sale, but you maybe aren't necessarily paying a monthly fee at the moment, right? And so to shift that from thinking about Shopify, where you might be spending as much as $100, or some of my clients even spend $200 a month on Shopify, and thinking, well, that doesn't sound worth it. Well, now we're going to start talking about what that Shopify fee can do for your business. So, in shifting your business from an Etsy strategy to a standalone e commerce site strategy, we're going to start talking about how your branding is going to start meeting the moment of your business, how you can tell the story of your brand, how you can write your own copy that doesn't have to fit in with Etsy's guidelines, where you can be more broad and general to the public and maybe even more searchable as a result, right? Now, all of this is definitely going to take you some more time, sort of. I'll get to that in a moment. But the trade-off is that you will likely make more sales, or you will get to keep more per sale. And so when we talk about, what is the ROI of Shopify, a lot of that ROI is going to be determined by the work and the dedication that you put into it. Now, I know some of you are going to be saying, oh, but that sounds like it takes so much more time. Well, when you started on Etsy, it likely took you time to figure out things like, what is the Etsy algorithm? How do I need to label this? How do I need to write this product copy for Etsy? Because Etsy is its own ecosystem. It's not as broad of an ecosystem as, say, Google. And so you had to learn how to write and adapt for the Etsy algorithm. Now you're going to be taking that same amount of time that, yes, you already spent, and you've got to transfer it to Shopify, and it doesn't transfer directly, right? The way that somebody wants you to write a description for Etsy is going to be very different than how the general public might be looking for something on Google and then find your website. So it isn't that it's going to take you more time. It's just that probably the time that you spent to build up your Etsy presence now has to be done all over again. Now, the trade-off, of course, is that you will have a standalone site where you get to tell the story of your brand. You get to make yourself look more professional. You get to sell higher ticket items. You get to do everything that you want to do with it and make more sales. You get to direct traffic to it. And you also get to keep more money per sale, because a platform like Shopify is charging you the credit card fee, but isn't charging you another, 7 to 10% for anything else. So the thing that I usually tell a lot of my clients is that what you'll want to do is actually go through and look at how much you are paying Etsy for every sale that you make, to compare it to that monthly Shopify fee and make a decision based on the numbers, because there's a really good chance that the ROI of a Shopify site might actually be better, especially if you're putting the same level and dedication into marketing it. And this is where we come back to the original topic, which is, what are your expenses doing for you? And in this case, when I hear people say Shopify seems too expensive, I've been paying for it, it's not doing anything for me, this is your chance to do something with it. So I go through this a lot with a lot of those other monthly charges, like are you paying for your email service provider, like a MailChimp or a Flowdesk or Klaviyo? And you might be thinking, this feels really expensive to not have a return on investment. And that's when we're going to circle back to your marketing planning and your marketing strategy, and ensuring that it's all working together, so that $40 a month, $20 a month, however much you're paying, is actually having a return on the original investment of paying that monthly fee. And rent. So I mentioned earlier, it's pretty standard in retail to start measuring your sales per square foot. Now, a lot of you might have just your own private studio space. Maybe it's just a portion of your home, but you could do this calculation too. Like, how many sales are you making per square foot of your studio rent? That might tell you what else you could be doing with that studio space. Could you be renting out a bench if that's an opportunity? Could you be working your marketing strategy to sell more so it does more justification? Could you be teaching classes out of it? How else can you make this rent work for you? And how can you turn that rent into a return on your investment? So you'll notice that at no point am I really talking about a pricing strategy and your expenses. And that's because your expenses are there to do all of the other work that needs to be done in your business to sell your work. So this is how you can start making decisions in your business. Do you show up to that trade show that's had zero ROI? Well, right now the answer might be no, unless it's doing something for your marketing strategy. To know this, you'll have to dive into the data of your business. Did attending that trade show give you a connection with a single store that's turned into a regular seller for you? Did your attendance at that craft show that was kind of iffy have a return on investment because somebody came back and bought an engagement from you later? This is how you might measure, because it can feel like, oh, yes, this craft show is $1,000 for a single weekend. Did it have a return? What should that return on investment be? And this is where you might start diving into those other calculations that you have to do in your business. I've coached many people through this process of actually looking at the hard data of their numbers. You attend a trade show that was $10,000. You took in $20,000 in revenue from that show. Was it worth it? And the answer is only kind of, right? But maybe it's part of building your presence. And so you're going to continue to do it, in which case you have to have a budget on hand to do it, right? But the idea is that you are always going back and measuring how these spent expenditures are working for you in your business. So it's not directly tied to your pricing strategy, but it's not totally divorced from it either. So let's talk labor for a moment. So at the top, I talked about how I always encourage my clients to build in a healthy labor rate from the very beginning. And that is for a number of reasons. But one of the core reasons is that it gives you a lot more options to decide whether or not to hire in the future. So a place where I've seen a lot of entrepreneurs get hung up is they didn't calculate their labor rate high enough in the beginning. They wound up doing gangbusters with selling. They were selling so much, but they didn't have any space in their budget to hire somebody to help them manage this high level of sales. If they had built in a healthy labor rate from the get-go, maybe it would have raised their prices to the extent that the sales wouldn't have been quite as swift and speedy, but now they have enough profit and enough space in their budget to decide whether or not to hire. So you can see that it does have that payroll cost might have not quite a one-to-one ratio with your pricing strategy in the formula itself, but you can see that giving yourself that healthy labor rate is going to make it easier to make choices down the road in your business. And also, this is one of the ways that you can decide who to hire in your business. Do you need a production assistant or do you need a marketing assistant? Do you need to hire somebody to do your production management, or do you need somebody just on the bench making stuff so that you can do the marketing and production management? But that will be on you to decide the best use of your funds to hire. So, one thing that you'll notice when I talk about payroll and I talk about staffing up your business, I'm not really talking about measuring the productivity of your staff. And the reason that I'm not is because that is your job. It's your job to train people in the ways that you would like your work to be made. It is your job to train people in the exact most efficient ways that you think they should be made. And it is also your job to listen to them when they have ideas that might help you. So I don't necessarily talk about measuring the productivity of your employees because that's not as easy of a calculation to make, because so much of that work is on you and needs to be done potentially in advance of hiring. I've worked in production jewelry, and I can tell you that when I was onboarded into a production jeweler's business, there were pattern books, there were methodologies, there were ways that the business already worked and functioned, and it's because the work had been done before I was ever hired to ensure that when it came to train me, things were laid out in a way that I could be brought up to speed within about a month. So you can see that there's really no part of your business that's truly divorced from any other part of your business. Talking about pricing strategy leads to a discussion about your expenses and what ROI you can expect from your expenses. Talking about your expenses also leads to a whole discussion about your operations and management and how you get to build your business based on all three of these elements: the money, the management, and the marketing. Let me know what questions you have, drop them in the comments, and remember to give this video a like.